Hello. Today I'm going to talk about the apocalypse, the end of the world, as it were. There are writings in the Gospels and in the New Testament that are apocalyptic in nature. For example, this passage that we heard on Sunday, Jesus said, "In those days after that suffering, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with power and great glory." What do we make of passages like that in the Bible? Well, first of all, apocalypse. Well, what is this? It comes from a Greek word meaning to reveal. The word simply means to reveal. So I think that suggests that to be something to be truly apocalyptic, there needs two things to happen. First of all, there needs to be something chaotic, some catastrophe occurring, something that is causing great upheaval, something terribly tragic, something that's causing maybe a lot of pain and suffering. That's the first thing. But secondly, and this is what is often forgotten, to make it truly apocalyptic, is that we need to see that there's some revealing going on in the midst of that chaos and catastrophe. And for Christians, we would say we would want to know what God is saying and doing in the midst of that terrible upheaval that was causing so much uncertainty and chaos and tragic loss and suffering and so forth. Only when those two things happen, then it's truly apocalyptic. We need the revelation of what God is doing and saying in the midst of the upheaval. And that's what drives the apocalyptic literature in the New Testament. And really in the New Testament there are two things that are at work or kind of behind this apocalyptic literature describing the end of all things. First of course, it's the death of Jesus. It's interesting in the Gospels, this apocalyptic literature, is not much of it in the Gospels, but it all happens just before Jesus' arrest and death. And I think that's interesting, because that Jesus' death was an apocalyptic moment. We don't often think of it like that, but it must have been, particularly at the time. This was not meant to happen. The Messiah, the Savior of the world, was not meant to die on the cross, and certainly, and everything leading up to Jesus' death was awful, and certainly not in keeping with what you would imagine for the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. His humiliation, his torture, his being spat upon, his being stripped naked before execution, naked on the cross, and the cruelty, the horror, the pain of the nails being driven into the arms and legs and so forth, the humiliation as well as the suffering, an apocalyptic moment. And in Mark's Gospel, which is the first Gospel, Jesus is totally abandoned on the cross, totally forsaken. There's no Mary or John at the foot of the cross as you see in John's Gospel. Jesus is utterly abandoned. And his final words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" An apocalyptic moment. But what makes it truly apocalyptic, of course, is the revelation, what God does and says in that tragedy. And of course we know that for Christians, God acts decisively on the cross. This is the moment not of abandonment, ironically, but the moment when the world is embraced by God, when God's love is revealed most fully and the world is saved. We see God's compassion, God's hope, and there is resurrection after death. To say there is hope, even in the midst of the most terrible situations, and we are never truly abandoned. There is always new life. That's what makes the death of Jesus truly apocalyptic. And the other thing driving this literature in the New Testament is the events around the 70 AD. And that's probably when the Gospel of Mark is being written, and shortly after Luke and Matthew. And what happened in 70 AD was the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman army, and the eventual destruction of the city by the same army. Terrible event. I've never being in a city under siege. But I can't imagine anything more fearful, more terrifying. To know that there's this approaching violent force of men approaching the city, and very likely I'm going to die, and very likely the way I die is not going to be at all easy at all, and it's going to be messy. We're going to run out of food, and it's going to be terribly unhygienic, and so forth. A truly fearful, apocalyptic moment. But again, what makes it apocalyptic is what God says and does in that moment. And for the Christians, God was saying, well, in a sense, the temple in Jerusalem is now replaced by our Lord Jesus. Jesus is the temple, and although the temple is destroyed, we still have access to God through Jesus. And though we are a dispersed people now, and the Jewish folks, we're dispersed around the world, God has not forsaken and abandoned us, just as God never forsaken and abandoned us when we were in Babylon. God continues to act through his people and speaks to his people and gives them encouragement and hope. And we have a mission now to the rest of the world. Now we're not focused on Jerusalem, we can focus on saving the whole world. So this apocalyptic stuff, I think, should resonate with us, because, I mean, for goodness sake, look at this past year or a couple of years for those of us living in Hong Kong. This has surely been apocalyptic times that we're living in. It was just a year ago. I'm recording this at the start of December. It was a year ago. If I went to Central on a Sunday afternoon after church, and I'd then quite likely be faced with lines of police, heavily armed, with tear gas and so forth, confronting mostly peaceful protests, not always peaceful, but protesters in the streets. I remember walking through Central one time and I saw a guy with a big metal rod just bashing a window in an MTR. I mean, this is amazing. And then since then we've had COVID and the pandemic. I think we're a bit in denial about just how terrible this pandemic is, although it's on the news and media all the time. As I record this, there's nearly 1.5 million people have died in the past year. 1.5 million have died from this disease in one year. I wasn't in Hong Kong when SARS was here, thank goodness. But I believe it was a terrifying moment for the people in Hong Kong and this part of the world. But 774 people died from SARS. And I believe people thought that was catastrophic. 774. Up to at the moment, nearly 1.5 million people have died from COVID-19, and more tragically will die, I'm sure. This is an apocalyptic moment, not just for the lives lost. I mean, that's ghastly enough as it is, but the economic loss of people who've had no income for the past year, people who have been isolated from family and friends for a long time. People are very uncertain and worried about the future, and rightly so. But what makes this terrifying situation that we're going through apocalyptic is not just that it's chaotic and terrible, but what God does and what God says to us through it. And that's where we can find inspiration in the apocalyptic literature in the New Testament. And let's not take it too literally. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you will know that he is near at the very gates. God is speaking to us in this terrible situation, reminding us that we are not forsaken, not as abandoned, that there is hope, and things can change for the better. These things will pass. COVID will pass. God is not unmoved by all this. God is here and present with us, very present with us in this terrible situation. And God's goodness will triumph. There will be a better future. New things will emerge, new things that are better. There is resurrection after the cross. Life is stronger than death. This is what makes something apocalyptic, not just the chaos, but the hope that what God says and does in the midst of that catastrophe. So I leave you with this on your mind to think about what are the apocalyptic moments in your life? What are the challenges, the struggle? What is the chaos and upheaval? What has been and what is that in your life and what might be? Focus on that, but also look for what God is saying and what God is doing in the midst of that upheaval. God is bringing something new. There is hope.